Robust. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Alton. Steve, don't go too far. For our next conversation about feeding the planet technology in the future, please welcome to the stage Teddy Bekele. He is Vice President of Agricultural Technology at Land O'Lakes. And I guess they're all coming out together. Danielle Nierenberg is President of the Sustainable Agricultural Research Group Food Tank. And Isha Datar is Executive Director of New Harvest, a nonprofit that supports innovation in cellular agriculture. And Zachary Lippman, Professor of Plant Biology and Genetics at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory. All of you, welcome. And Steve is back.
Guess who? I'm back. Thank you, Margaret. You thought you were going to get a new moderator, but no such luck. Zachary, did you hear the last conversation?
I did.
I just want to ask you a quick. Is Alton Brown a flat earther in food?
No
I mean, you're the CRISPR guy, right?
That's right.
Did you convince him CRISPR's great while you were in the green room?
We actually had a brief discussion on this, and he asked me, you know...
Who won the discussion?
We didn't get that far, but I'm sure I would have done well. No, he asked me, you know, what's the value of this technology, or what kind of questions do you want to ask with it? And so I tried to explain, you know, why the powerful technology offers us this opportunity to change agriculture.
So I'm a realist in everything, and a realist in everything, if you're true to being a realist in national security or healthcare, whatever policy discussion you may have, is there are winners and losers, there are pluses and minuses, there are costs and benefits. So as you look at your world of CRISPR and genetically editing food in ways that create such new opportunities, we often hear about what are we not talking about that you would worry about, that you think, and so I'm asking you to be a food realist, not a food triumphalist, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I mean, as a scientist, it's difficult for me to address that because I see CRISPR as a technology to reimagine crops in a way that was never before possible. So for me, I'm always looking at the upside. Of course, I'm always thinking in the back of my head, you know, what could be these consequences? But ultimately, I'm thinking this is a technology. We just heard Alton talk about diversity and how diversity is now limited. But in fact, breeders are now going back to diversity they have for the last 2 decades to all these other varieties of rice, for example, to try to improve adaptation. With gene editing, we don't have to go through this laborious, slow process of breeding. We can now immediately go in, and with knowledge of the genes that control adaptation or yield, we can immediately edit those in a very efficient way, which allows us to expedite the process of breeding. So I see a big upside.
Did you read Bill Joy's piece years ago in Wired magazine about the future doesn't need us, and his worry was that in the advances in computer technology and computer power and, you know, genetics, that the world we were going to create was going to come and bite us someday? Does that cross? I'm going to go to Danielle next, but, you know, Danielle, please take him on. Like, you know, right? You have an alternative view.
No.
Tell me where Zach is wrong.
I don't know if I can say Zach is wrong. I think CRISPR is a very interesting technology for agricultural nerds like me. It's fascinating, right? My question is, who has control over the technology? Who does it benefit? Will it benefit farmers? You know, I ask these same questions about biotechnology and agriculture all the time. Who does it benefit? Who has control? How are these things going to be used in a way that's effective?
But you're worried about monopolies.
Well, and I'm worried about taking power away from farmers.
Right.
And there are no farmers on this panel to, you know, share their viewpoints on this. So
we're going to go to farmers.
I'm sort of put in that position.
No, it's good.
Yeah, so, I mean, I've worked a lot with farmers over the years. I grew up working on a farm in Connecticut from when I was 13. I still talk to the farmer that I worked with farmers in Israel. And if you talk to them, they're very practical people. Their interest is in what simplifies their lives.
Right, they're business people.
They're business people. And so they hear about a technology. Most times they're agnostic to the technology, and they're just most focused on what can you give me, what can you deliver, right? Whether it's a big, you know, corporate company that's trying to provide new germplasm, new breeding material, or if it's something that we're just trying to think about urban agriculture and how we might adapt crops that were never allowed to be grown in urban settings, and how we can do that.
From my perspective, and I've traveled all over the world, you know, spoken to hundreds and hundreds of farmers, I've never heard a farmer say, what can you give me? Farmers want to be included in the development and research process. And I think that's part of the issue with a lot of these big technologies, that there's not a lot of participatory research and development going on. Well-meaning scientists and development organizations go into communities, tell them what they need rather than asking them what their problems are and what needs to be solved in a lot of cases. And the more that we can include a participatory model so that communities have a say in how research...
So let's stop right there for a minute. I'm going to run over to Lindsay here. and her husband Benjamin. Well, you represent youth farmers, is that right? And you're actually a farmer, young farmers, youth farmer. It's pretty close. Yeah, you're an editor. So just in quick response, I hate saying this word short form, but I mean it. What do you want when you kind of look at this evolving world? And you just heard Danielle sort of talk about farmers wanting included in this area of modernization. What's your take on this?
Well, I'm gonna pass it to the person who spends many hours a week farming.
Okay, Benjamin.
Sure. So I run a farm, and it's a diversified farm, growing vegetables and also producing animal products. And I think Danielle said it very well. And I mean, I think to me, what has been dwindling, in recent decades, has been research happening at universities, at public institutions. There are still strong ag programs, but they've been more and more funded by corporations, things like that. And so what Danielle is saying really resonates with me. We want farmers involved in the process, and with control over the technology, and control and directing where the technology is going, who it's helping, and not just farmers, but the public at large. People who are eating as well. It shouldn't just be coming from the top down. And I'm not personally opposed to CRISPR as a technology, but it concerns me that this kind of pamphlet here is kind of trying to convince you that it's good. Like, if you need to be convinced that it's good, then maybe it's not going to happen just from the top down. There needs to be something broader.
And real quick, I'm going to jump to Camille. I don't know if any of you have read this fantastic Atlantic article on the microbiome at some point, but it's part of the diversity question in this, but it also rates of farming. But Camille, what with Danielle and with Zach, what would be your quick take?
Yeah, I agree that I'm the CEO of a small New York-based company called Affiner, and we work around microbiome, like redesigning fermentations, redesigning communities of microbes to do interesting things on plants and on food. So yeah, when we look at food, especially at food fermentation, in our process to actually produce a new product, we actually try to involve consumers as much as possible. And so one of the ways that we did that as a company was to launch our first product on Kickstarter. And that was not really for the money, but it was to have this discussion platform, to have kind of a direct interaction with the first customers and trying to tell them the story about why microbes are interesting and why they might not be interesting for different types of applications. So yeah, I think it really needs to be a conversation between people who own and develop the technologies and people who are going to benefit from them.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask, oops, my leg just went out there, so my apologies. Isha, as you've now heard our technologists, our person saying we need to worry about governance and power. We've gone to the farmers and we've gone to kind of a science of microbiome. You're part of in the plant-based beef industry, as I want to call it.
Nope.
Okay, yeah, okay. Go ahead.
We call this field cellular agriculture, and it's the idea that we're growing foods like meat, milk, and eggs from cell cultures rather than from whole plants or whole animals. And I wanted to echo what was said about kind of ag departments and ag research, I guess, not being sexy and not attracting the best and brightest, because I'll go to so many future of food conferences and note that the co-founders are rarely coming from agriculture or have an agriculture background or even went to a school that had an agriculture department. And I wonder about that. I wonder, is that something we can change in the education system that makes agriculture something that actually attracts people who really want to do something?
We have NYU and CUNY here tonight, so we'll have to go to them and say, come on, guys, and they may disagree with you. But when you kind of look at this broader question, and again, I want to keep in the back of our minds that our job tonight, whether you are worried about governance and power, whether you're worried about CRISPR, is how do we feed 10 billion people, and where does technology come into this? And I really am interested in the costs and benefits of growth. I mean, there are, as apparently in this New York Times piece, which no one read, about this rice kernel, very interesting story. There are consequences in the competition between different strains of things, and I'm interested in how you look at that as a technologist.
So I guess the thing that we're working on is growing meat from muscle cultures. And right now, when we think about factory farming, that's kind of monocultured in a certain way. We focus on a few different types of breeds. And so our thinking is that perhaps in these really early stage pieces of research where we're isolating the first cells from these animals that we want to perpetuate, that we actually can not bring back, but isolate cells from some of these species that may have been lost otherwise, with a better understanding of where these species came from.
Is your work open source?
Yes.
It is open source.
Well, I mean, it's as open
so
as
you
we
can be
possibly
friends.
make it. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, the
Yeah.
governance thing is very huge to me. I got interested in this field because I thought it was such a natural progression for food
Right.
to get more, you know, kind of controlled and move towards this kind of area where people are more involved in the science behind how their food is made, even to the cellular level, and how it seems potentially more efficient to be producing foods from cells rather than from whole organisms. But I was just so concerned about who would be controlling those ideas and those technologies and who would be prevented from participating. And I think the concept of farmers participating is something that's interesting, but I also think an interesting concept is who are farmers and what is a farmer when we're talking about growing
This takes us
foods from
perfectly to
cell
Teddy.
Yeah.
So Teddy, you're the tech guy for Land O'Lakes, which I kept asking my team, isn't that the butter company? And they kept telling me it's so much more. And so I want to consider myself educated a bit tonight. But you know, as you're dealing with your big association of farmers and co-ops, and I'm also interested in the fact that you came from Ethiopia, your father was into crop protection, and you bring a kind of you left Ethiopia when you were 4, but you bring a kind of genetic international orientation, if anything, to these broader questions. As you look at this question of how farmers see this, particularly not massive scale, macro scale farmers, but those that are doing this, what's missing for them? What are they not getting in the way the equation is working right now that they need?
You know, what's interesting is that some of the conversations we had earlier was the fact that, you know, farmers, or somebody is just pushing down a solution to farmers, and which, you know, probably tends to happen in big business. But I will tell you that farmers don't easily accept the solution or whatever's told to them. They are as skeptical as they get. You know, we're in an audience like this. It takes me so long to get somebody to crack a smile. You know, everybody just crosses their arms and just looks at you, and then they look like, you know, you came from Mars.
They hardly smiled at LeSueur peas.
So what I would say is, you know, they really need to be convinced. I mean, one of the things they have to do is year over year is, I mean, I learned this term. I always heard that you bet the farm on it.
Right.
But they are betting their farm every single year.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, you're borrowing money. And you have to grow crops and you have to make it, right? And every year it's a challenge. So they want to make sure that whatever they're going to plant in their fields makes
So as they look at science and technology coming down the pack, and you know what I've learned in this industry is that the innovation going on in this sector is as wild and transformative as in any other sector that technology is changing everything right now. And it's just not something that, you know, at least in the policy circles in DC, I mean, it's not discussed as much, but it's wild. How do they look at that? I mean, do they look at that as a net positive for them? Do they fear that tidal wave?
I would say they're very practical, right? Very pragmatic, very practical. So they will take a look at it and really evaluate it. In a lot of cases, what they'll do is they'll give it 3 years. So the first year might be, you know what, I'll try it on 2 fields. The next year might be, okay, I'll give it 3 fields. And then the third year, if they're convinced that the technology is worthwhile, then they'll adopt it, you know, across their entire farm. So that's typically the progression we go through, and those are the things I deal with, right? So technology, we come over there and say, look, we should use satellite imagery to look how your crops are doing and look at this big piece of land and how can you manage it all. And the guy looks up in the sky and goes, yeah, I don't know about that. You know, and so then I have to sit there and truly show him what that means. And so after a while we get through and then they see the value of it and then they'll adopt it. So
one of the things that I think is such a part of almost every discussion that we do is a question of trust. Trust of the players, stakeholders, who's duplicitous, who's real, you know, are there safe zones where real discussions can take place? Let me just ask you all broadly. If you were to have a wand of power and your job was to figure out how to reestablish trust between players in this industry that is obviously complicated, it's tense, this is perhaps a lot more kumbaya sounding than I think the reality is out there. And I'm interested in what you would do. Let me start with Danielle to reestablish trust.
Well, I mean, I think forums like this where you're bringing different people together with different perspectives, that's one of the things that my organization, Food Tank, tries to do, bring together different perspectives. You can't be preaching to the choir.
Hold the mic a little closer.
Sorry, you can't be preaching to the choir all the time, and I think that's where we get stuck in this rut where we're just talking to each other and talking to ourselves. So the more you can have open forums and debates where people are brought together in a really, you know, not intellectually stimulating. Oh, not, it can be, but it just needs to be very open, where people can share their thoughts without fear of being criticized, but just being understood.
Zachary?
Yeah, I mean, as a scientist, I'm probably the least trustful person of myself and everybody else, because we're constantly evaluating other people's results and their data. And so I think the thing that I've learned over the years, both in the lab and then translating what we've discovered in the lab to the field, is that sense of urgency to get people to adopt that trust comes from hard science, hard data. So when I think about demonstrating the power of CRISPR technology, it's to show people this is what can be done. And so the proof is in the pudding, right? You look at these plants, you see what you were able to do, and then you demonstrate both practically and then also theoretically what is now possible beyond what I've shown you. And so I think, as you said, it's practicality, right? So farmers, at the end of the day, they want to see the plants, they want to know how this is better than what they've been dealing with for all these years, and then they'll adopt it, and it'll be agnostic of technology.
Do you think, I mean, I'm going to go to all of you on this question, but I just want to go a stage deeper with Zach for a minute. Recently, we had a program at MIT, the Atlantic hosted, I think it was MIT, maybe Harvard, but I interviewed somebody from the Broad Institute that was dealing with CRISPR and ag technology. And he gave a similar answer. And I guess in the sense, it made me wonder at the time whether science and the way it proceeds really has to worry about social impacts at all, whether it has to worry about the system at all. And maybe the system is saying, hey, worry about us, but science just doesn't work that way. It's a detached thing. And I'm just interested in whether you see it that way.
Yeah, I mean, more and more. So, for example, I'm funded from the National Science Foundation. I have a few grants from the National Science Foundation.
But what you do could wipe out all farmers, for instance.
No. In fact, the way I look at our technology, not our technology.
Yeah,
You can't hear it, huh? Yeah, it's better. The way I look at what's possible with gene editing and a whole slew of even classical breeding techniques that actually will integrate with gene editing is that we can create new farmers, right? So again, I'll come back to an example that I think is tangible, especially being in New York City, urban agriculture. It's possible to now imagine how we can adapt crops to urban agriculture environments. We talked about food deserts. Maybe this is an opportunity now where we can address this. So in fact, I think it's the complete opposite.
But those things are already happening independent of CRISPR. Urban agriculture is happening all over New York.
They are, but it's leafy greens, and those leafy greens are very limited in what they can provide, and it's really not a sustainability. And again, it's a business question. So leafy greens are very high value,
but other crops are being grown in cities as well. I mean, I've been all over the world.
No, but
farmers are growing crops everywhere.
I'm talking not about just in plots of land in urban settings. I'm talking about putting them into abandoned warehouses where we can adapt. We work on tomato, for example.
Farms is doing that in New Jersey.
Right.
These things are already happening without CRISPR.
Right. But it can happen a lot more efficiently and a lot faster with this technology. And at the end of the day, what is CRISPR doing? We talked about natural variation and diversity. Nature has been one of the most powerful contributors to the diversity for breeders starting 6,000 to 8,000 years ago. What CRISPR is doing is just creating what nature has already demonstrated is the most powerful genetic variation for improving crops, and we're just doing it in a more efficient way. So now with urban agriculture, you're absolutely right, it's happening all over the place, but there are so many other opportunities to expand that, and there are crops that are just not customized for that. Now we can start to think about doing that.
Isha.
Isha.
Oh, Isha, excuse me.
Is this a question about trust?
No, it's not a trick question. I mean, your industry has to figure out how to create trust, right?
Yes, because cellular agriculture is so new as a concept, an industry, a field of research that I actually kind of feel a responsibility to introduce trust and to think of things differently instead of just creating the same industry we already have for food production. But I think one thing that we do somewhat well is that we're introducing kind of a lot of self-criticism very early on. I think a lot of people think that our organization is
What's the biggest criticism you think you deserve?
Is this the best thing to move forward? Is this how we're going to feed 10 billion people?
That's pretty big. Good.
I don't know. You know what? I don't think there's any single way we're going to feed that many people. And I also sometimes question, are we going to have that many people? Is that the thing that we want to be aiming towards? I mean, we talk about diversity in all these ways, but 10 billion of one species doesn't seem very diverse to me. But so I'm thinking, one thing that we do is we have an event every year where we bring in a lot of people who kind of say things that make us feel like, wait, Okay, yeah, that's a good point. And I think sometimes people come away feeling like a little bit down or a little bit like we're haters of our own work. But actually, I think we need to confront the issues up front. I still think that these are questions worth asking and answering, but we won't know what those questions are if we just kind of plow ahead forward without really
Fascinating. I love that answer.
knowing.
Teddy, how about Land O'Lakes?
Yeah, the question of trust. So I'll go back to, kind of the audience that I deal with, which is Midwest farmers, right? And how do you establish trust with them? So, one of the things we wholeheartedly believe is that agronomy is local, right? So we can bring all the technology, whether it's software or biotech, but ultimately it's that farmer that knows his fields and has worked with them for a number of years, and the folks around him, right? So his agronomist, his crop consultant, his equipment dealer, his banker. So in order for it to establish trust, you don't only just have to educate that farmer, you have to educate everybody around that farmer, right? And so therefore, they're also believing that this is the right direction to go, this is good for all of us. And they all live in small communities, which, their kids play soccer together, they've known each other for a number of times. So the way to establish that is to create that community trust, and then from there we can build upon that.
Let me ask you a slightly, go down a degree with you as well. And I don't know if I'm going to get this right, but from your perspective, when you look at sort of the large transnational scale industry in the agriculture world, and you look at the smaller farmer, I want you to critique both sides. What is the small farmer getting wrong that they could do better on, and what is the large macro industry getting wrong that you would say, hey, this would help move things forward?
Yeah. So on the large side, that's a good question, because earlier we talked about we focused on fewer crops, right? Because we want to produce more. Well, variety and volume don't always go hand in hand, right? So if you want more volume, you get it to a couple of people that do it really well, and then so they produce a lot more of that. So when we go to the 10 billion people, that's what happens. But that's the critique on that side, right? So have we lost that? Have we gone all corn and soybeans in the United States, and have we lost other crops? On the smaller side, though, at the same time, it's, we go sometimes maybe too niche, right? I mean, there's maybe a little bit more to be learned from the larger farmers, and so how do you combine those things together? Maybe that's the little yin and yang deal there. So
interesting. I'm going to go to all of you in a moment. Nevin, wherever you are, I'm going to give the universities a chance to bite back. But I want to ask you a question about food waste. And I go to many of these forums and come in and moderate. Food waste comes up all the time. It comes up all the time. You hear it from, I met the chief of sustainability for United Technologies. It's an obsession of his. You'd hear this Blue Farms guy up north obsession. Why? Everybody talks about it who's in the food industry, but I don't feel like the needle is moving at all. And so I'm interested in, how do you take this from being something folks lament about, to use that word again, to actually creating action in the food waste? Or do I have it wrong, that actually more is happening in this than I think? Danielle?
Well, I think you have a lot of it wrong. I think companies are finally taking on this issue after years of ignoring it. At the first World Food Conference in Rome in 1974, there was a call for a reduction.
But what are they doing? Other than talking about
they're changing their practices and retailing establishments. We're trying to fix expiration and sell-by dates. There's a lot happening that's sort of under the radar. But this gets back to the question of tonight's conversation, which is, can we feed the 10 billion?
Right.
We can, because we're wasting 1.3 billion tons of food every year. So if we're concerned about feeding the world, we should really be investing more. Foundations, especially the funding and donor.
But you think gravity's moving in the right direction?
Absolutely. If you look at this issue 10 years ago, when I started thinking about it, and others were too, there was no one interested in it. People were saying it wasn't a problem. Now that's changed. There are PSAs from the ad console about how consumers can prevent food waste in their own homes. Retailers, it's on the top of their radar at every conference, every business meeting. I think it's really changing.
So we'll get to a point where it's solved and we don't have to talk about it so much. Teddy?
Yeah, you have to look at the whole food value chain, right? So if you look at each component, obviously you miss the point. But when you look at the whole thing end to end, that's one of the benefits for Land O'Lakes, because we see that. There is stuff happening today. Maybe not going as fast as we wanted, but there's a lot of folks taking the food waste now and trying to see if they can turn that back into fertilizer.
Right.
So you can go back around and then fertilize the crops to begin with.
I guess I'm a numbers guy. I mean, just to put it on, I'm a numbers guy. So I keep hearing about the staggering levels of food waste, and I just know it's been a topic for years. I'm thrilled to hear this is going on, but I'm sort of interested in when the numbers begin shifting and changing, and that's what I guess I'm not feeling. As I watch the data on this, I've become obsessed with food waste for some reason, but it doesn't seem from at least a measurement perspective, if you were to go and look at the economists that covers these things now and then, that those numbers have been shifting.
But part of the issue around food waste is there has been a lack of data, and so
Right.
we don't really know the true numbers. So that, you know, the World Resources Institute and many others are
Right.
working to change that.
Aisha,
Get that data.
you wanted to jump in, I could tell.
Yeah, I was thinking about trust in food waste because, you know, expiration dates and people don't really know how they can interact with their food and how long it'll go bad. And I would hear about friends who would like forget to take their lunch to work and then think they had to throw their lunch out when they got back. I'm like, no, you don't have to do that. But I also get why if you're a milk producer, you're not going to change the expiration date on the milk. So for me, my trust when I think about expiration dates is I just go to blogs and stuff, and I found out I could keep me some in my fridge for 4 years.
Zachary, you can make food that doesn't expire, right?
No, I'm just thinking about my father and how
Yeah.
every time he comes and visits, he sees a yogurt all the way in the back. It's been sitting there for a month, and he says, it's still good, and he eats it. So he has full trust that that's exactly fine. And actually, I think
do the same.
Yeah.
Let me open up to you guys. Where's Nevin? Nevin, Yemi, I'm going to come to you right up, but let me give Nevin an opportunity to bite back. So you're at, am I saying it right, Cooney or SUNY? Cooney.
CUNY.
Okay, there you go.
I'm at the CUNY School of Public Health, and we look at food systems that cities can actually help influence. And Alton mentioned this earlier on, that cities could be laboratories of innovation. And one of the things that cities can do is actually invest in infrastructure to make regional farming, small-scale farming, much more profitable. And that's, you know, distribution systems, processing systems, investing in businesses that use regionally produced food and add value to it.
I think the critique I was hearing from the stage was a little more direct. They were saying that the universities, and where's my friend from NYU? There you are. We're not producing people who are doing innovative leadership in the food industry. Do you believe that is wrong or right?
I think it depends on which land-grant college you look at. There are really interesting programs at certain land-grant colleges focusing on sustainable agriculture. But many universities like CUNY and others depend on industry funding to do research, and so it's directed towards processes and products that are.
Thank you. Let's go to Carolyn Dimitri real quick. Carolyn, is that right? There you go.
I think just the way we're seeing shifts in the food system landscape and the way people are thinking about.
Hold a little bit closer.
We're also seeing a shift in education. At NYU, we have a food systems program. We have the first urban farm in the city, right on Houston Street. You can walk by and take a look at it between LaGuardia and Mercer. But land grants are reshaping their focuses. People are really aware of the importance of food and the importance of on-farm sustainability. So I do think that everyone is adapting, and many of the land grants are shifting, and non-land grants are shifting out of the commodity agriculture world into the broader look at.
Real quick, Carolyn, how are you using or not involving technology in the curriculum and what you're doing, how you look at your benchmarks of success and direction? How is that part of your story?
I personally do not do that. I teach my classes, and I try to make an impact on my students, and my students are highly committed to careers affecting change in the food system, and I think they're young and they're out there and they're starting, and I expect in the next 5 to 10 years we'll see them in greater leadership roles and positions of power in corporations and in nonprofits.
Isha?
In my experience, I mean, we're doing research that has a little bit of bioengineering, a little bit of food science stuff, and those two things often do not exist in the same school with the same degree of excellence. And we have to do very unique things where we kind of mash schools together and have people traveling around because they just don't seem to coexist. And I think, so they're literally siloed.
Do any of you work with universities yet? Does Land O'Lakes, what's your favorite university?
It's the University of Minnesota.
That's your favorite university?
Well, it's right.
How many universities did you just push off the cliff?
Well, I didn't go there. So,
yeah, I know. Okay.
University of Minnesota, Purdue University, and Iowa State.
But Minnesota's top. So why are they? What are they doing that's correct?
Well, Minnesota is first of all, it's right. You know, the big agricultural school.
Yeah.
Right? So and everything we need from technology to business and the agricultural piece are all there.
Right.
So for us to get the right mix, and those schools are starting to work together. So a lot of these programs are coming out, and we get to influence a lot of what we need, and so that's kind of the
fascinating.
We have.
Let me open it. Yes. Hi, Hannah. Question. You have a question? Or you did not? Oh, I see. You would have won the painting at the auction. I don't know. I thought you sort of, you know. Yeah, okay, great. Yeah, good. Who are you with?
Transformation.
Nice to see you. So, yes.
Should I hold it or do? Okay, so
You looked like you were about to just jump out of your chair with a question.
The intersection of waste and tech.
Right.
And so what we do is we have this app that allows people to schedule pickups for extra food on demand. So it works like Uber, but for extra food. So if you say from here, there's probably going to be a lot of food that people aren't going to eat. So you can schedule like an on-demand pickup, and we'll take it to the closest homeless shelter or.
Is that you?
Yes, that's me.
Oh, I love this story.
Oh.
No, I've read about this. It's incredible. Incredible
Where?
story. Yeah. I think, well, I've read about something in the Washington Post. They did a story in a profile. Was that you?
Yeah, that was.
That was you. Wow. I do read still.
Yeah, but one of the biggest problems that I realized, and what we're going to be sort of tackling as if we're trying to feed way more people, moving forward, is that there aren't institutions where you can drop this food off, I feel, and the infrastructure to sort of feed these people. Like, the food is there. The infrastructure to move the food is there. We just don't have institutions where people can be fed on a mass scale. Because what we've noticed is our pickups range from 60 pounds to 360 pounds. And the problem is that when you drop it off somewhere, they usually don't have the storage, they don't have the staff, they don't have the budget to hold it. And so the problem isn't just the food, it's also the storage of the food and where you give it and the institutions that don't exist to kind of disperse it.
So I want to go to Yemi next, but before I leave, I asked Danielle if things were going, if gravity was taking there, if a lot. So maybe because of you it will be solved. But how do you feel? Is it a bleak subject where you need heroism and lots of effort and work to achieve more, or are you confident that the system is just making the right decisions and is going to solve this problem
regarding feeding
food? Yeah, waste and.
I definitely think that it can be solved. I just think we have to use what already exists instead of building more. Like, we work with Uber, we work with Lyft, we work with cargo bikers, and that's the fastest, easiest way because they're already there and they already move things around.
Distribution.
Can I just ask a question? Because I'm curious. So I'm thinking, we're talking about food waste and how we can put better infrastructure in place for distribution. But I often think about that in the context of who we are and where we live, which is Western country and urban environments. I mean, then I'm thinking, well, if it's 10 billion people, not all 10 billion people live in such environments. No. What about these countries where you have sustainable farmers? And I think that's really another question about feeding the world that we're not really touching upon.
Well, I know Danielle is furious that we've all avoided 4 famines in Africa that no one's talked about, right? That is a quote from you.
Absolutely.
I think. Yeah. I mean, how furious are you?
I mean, I think it's deplorable that, these things are happening around the world, and, we forget that farmers in the developing world are struggling, and they're struggling because of climate change. They're struggling because of lack of political will. They're struggling because they don't have the resources and education that they need to do their jobs as well as they can. But when you're talking about things like, when we're talking about waste, post-harvest losses are a huge problem in the developing world. There's a lot of renewed interest in helping prevent those post-harvest losses, building better infrastructure like roads, which are often terrible in developing countries, making sure farmers can get their crops to market before they rot.
I mean, we don't have the time this evening, but I think one of the most very interesting subjects on that, when you get to technology and food and GMOs and others, I was talking to a former head of one of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation leads on crop management, and Bill was a big believer in and it remains a big believer in GMOs and others, and were often attacked. But frankly, this was a way in which they were able to kind of move food production in a very different direction. But it gets back to that cost thing. What is happening to diversity? What's happening to sort of other parts of the economic equation there? So I think it's a huge subject. Yemi, let me bring you the mic. Millions of people watching online, literally.
I just wanted to
hi, folks. Yemi, this is Yemi. Tell them who you are.
My name is Yemi Amu, and I am a farmer in Bushwick, Brooklyn. I'm an aquaponics farmer, so I raise fish and vegetables in a recirculating.
Do you have visitations? Can people come up and do tastings and stuff?
You can go to my website, www.okofarms.com.
Oku Farms.
OKO.
OKO Farms.
Farm in my language.
Yeah, okay,
I'm
great.
Yoruba. I'm a Yoruba woman from Nigeria.
Excellent.
So I just feel very compelled to say that what's missing in this conversation, we're talking about food deserts, is that we're not talking about community-based solutions. right?
So
There are
tell us.
people in communities. I will speak for New York because I've been living in New York for 20 years now, and I've been farming here for about 10 years, is that, we have urban farms. Yes, they may be small lots, but these small lots are growing food. They're empowering people to feed themselves and their families. They're growing crops that are coming from countries from around the world, right? So when we're talking about diverse crops, people are growing rice, and people are growing callaloo, and people are growing Malabar spinach, and people are growing, I call it jutes. It's a way to my language, but there's some called something else here. So there are solutions that are coming from these so-called food deserts, but these places don't get attention. Food deserts in New York have been urban farms before, warehouses started growing greens. People are growing real food that are putting food in their bellies. People are growing food that is going to food shelters 2 blocks away or 3 blocks away. So, maybe people in these communities should also be part of these conversations because they're missing. We can't talk about...
Well, I'm glad you raised this. I
Yeah.
mean, how big, and I do know that there's a big network out there, but I also feel as if any discussion, there's also a tendency to live in silos.
Exactly.
So even though this is really cool and it sounds great, I can tell you that in many bleak parts of Baltimore, this is not going on. Maybe in certain parts of Baltimore it is, or if you go to St. Louis.
The more attention
Yeah.
we give communities that are doing this work, the
So
more
what
we
do you
can
think needs to be
inspire
done?
other people to do it.
Yeah, so what do you think needs to be done?
I think that we should, when we're talking about technology and we're talking about, growing greens, or we're talking about getting food to food shelters and reducing waste, maybe it's reaching out and finding out who some of these growers are in local communities that can be growing food for these shelters. Because many of community gardens actually grow food that are taken to not just shelters, but soup kitchens, and, so there are solutions that are happening within communities, and people are inspired. I was inspired to start growing food because I visited places around the country where people were doing it in the least expected places. I grow food between a liquor store and a tobacco shop. That's where
I totally want to visit, and I totally want to go to the fish farm. So be prepared. Yes, right here. We're going to take one last question right here. Bertha, yes, and we've got a microphone for you.
Hi.
Tell us where you're from.
Yeah, I'm Berta Jimenez. I'm from Rice Products. We take organic byproducts and convert it into ingredients. And I think one of the things, so we go to our local brewers, we take the spent grain, which is just barley. We have a patent-pending technology, we dehydrate it, and we make it into a flour that has high protein, high fiber, and low carbs. And our technology also works with other byproducts, like byproducts of wine, distilleries, and juice, and a couple more. But the thing is, I think in all this conversation, food waste is great, but we're putting a lot of pressures to the consumers. But I think many of the industries are producing so much food waste, and we just we don't see it. For instance, to make a 6-pack of beer, you lose 1 pound of barley, and you just throw it because you don't see the potential of this. So I think having putting also pressure on companies to be zero waste is something we should also be thinking, because it's not only a consumer's job, it's everybody's job. Actually, with what we're throwing with spent grain in the world, and the things there's beer everywhere. It's not only about the United States. We can feed, South America population. So it's just something I think there's not going to be a lack of food. It's just we have to be prepared to see, byproducts and look at ingredients.
It's redefining what waste actually is and using different terms. And I think, big companies have a lot to learn from smaller companies like yours, because you're looking at waste very differently than they are. And that's a huge lesson to be learned.
Let me just ask as we wrap up. In anticipation of this and some of the other programs we at the Atlantic have been doing, I visited a farm on the eastern shore of Maryland where there's tons of soy being grown, tons of corn. There's a big farm out there, Chino Farm. So the guy Henry Sears, and years ago he began working with Harvard and MIT in taking segments of the farm and beginning to research how you could manipulate different factors and how you could bring in new technologies, like what we were hearing from Alton and others about the way water and irrigation works. What would you do with wild grasses and this whole arena. And then on top of that, he's got an incredible bird migration thing where I've gone out and banded little baby owls, or they're not babies, but they're like little white. It's such a cool thing. If you guys want to do it sometime, they have 90 nets throughout this farm. But how, you know, the whole issues of crops and how you manage them affect wildlife and other kinds of migrating species. So I guess I want to ask the deep question, the human question, maybe the earth question, which is, if you were to look at things, you know, and how we know where science is doing, we know that technology is progressing, how would you tilt things? What are the things that we need to be more aware of as humans that consume and have a big task ahead feeding everyone? You know, a lot of us have boutique issues we really care about, but I'm interested in sort of step out of that for a moment and just give us a snapshot of what you think might be done in like the spirit of something like Chino Farms, of research, balance, you know, looking at small farms, macro farms. Teddy, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, that's a great question. So for me, I mean, you know, I go back to the farmer really cares about his fields, right? I mean, especially the ones that are generational. I mean, it's handed over, so they want to leave the farm in a better condition than the way they found it. And so they're all open for new innovations, whether it's cover crops or beehives. I mean,
right.
they want that, right? So I think, I mean, all of us, as we go into our little niche areas and learn different things, we can bring that to these farmers. And if we convince them that it's practical and it's the right thing and sustainable for their farm, they will adopt those things. So I think it's a matter of we should keep doing what we're doing and going in different areas and learning about all these things, and then bringing that back to the farmer, because if it's right for the earth, if it's right for that farmer, they will engage in those practices.
Zachary?
Yeah, for me, I think it's thinking about how climate change is making us rethink how we're breeding crops, and that the old way of thinking there's stability, right, is starting to shift. And farmers like stability, right? They want a stable environment, and now they have these fluctuations that are changing their productivity. And so with that in mind, I think we have to really consider that whatever the technology is, that has got to be a focus for plant breeding in the future. And we're talking about public universities training the next generation of breeders. We have these conversations a lot. I have them in a lot of forums with colleagues. This is something that needs to happen, and that next generation of breeders has to be based in the classical techniques, but willing to adopt and explore the new technologies.
Isha?
I think this whole food conversation just needs a sprinkle of humility. I think on the level of the people working on technology, realizing that no single technology is going to solve all our problems, and it won't just be technology, it'll be technology and communities and and people getting together and all kinds of organization and governance things. And then on the consumer level, some humility about what you can eat. We can all eat Wonder Bread once in a while. It's okay. You know, it's not.
Don't
it's not
say that. No.
You don't need to feel guilty about
so
consuming those things sometimes.
Maybe I secretly still am. Danielle, last word.
So for me, it's about recognizing that there are a lot of invisible players that we're not seeing. We're not seeing them on stage tonight. Women farmers make up nearly half of the world's agricultural labor force. It's not just men in fields farming, it's women. We need to recognize the role of youth, the role of workers. These are often people who are ignored and invisible in the food system, and the more that we can raise up what they're doing and highlight it and make sure that they, again, have the access to resources and education that they need to do their jobs really well.
Such an important way to end our conversation. I want to thank you. Teddy Bekele, Isha Datar, I'm sorry, Zachary Lippman and Danielle Nierenberg, thank you so much. Wonderful conversation.
Thank you.
Echoing Steve, thank you, Zachary, Danielle, Isha, and Teddy, and thank you again, Steve. This was, I like to think, a nutritious conversation, to be sure. Exploring the future of food, what we eat, about waste and technology and trust. These are issues that we will continue to cover in the pages of The Atlantic, online, and on stage. I want to once again thank the Agriculture Division of Dow DuPont for making this evening possible, but mostly I want to thank all of you for being here. I know how precious your time is, so thank you for spending so much of it with us.
And I just want to say,
not to be coming to my mouth.
And thank you, Margaret. I will move beyond my green peas and tuna in a can to new opportunities and become more humanly connected to our
as a
agriculture
reward,
network. So thank you.
As a reward, we do have more drinks. We have yes, dessert. No Wonder Bread, no Big Macs, but we have coffee and tea. We would love you to hang out, meet one another, talk to one another, and hang out with us. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful night.